gift, so thank you for that. And maybe in the spirit of trying to have some also time to think further together, we move to Nika and David, if you guys are able.
No. See, in the spirit of reception, let me think about that notion. It reminds me a little of Spinoza, where power is both the power to act, but also to be acted on, or to affect and to be affected at the same time, which is interesting because I had been thinking about the notions of care and freedom in somewhat similar terms. So I was going to start by in that spirit, actually reacting to something that John Dubrovsky said earlier, which was about sensibilities. He said there's a sort of a difference between you and him about is it possible to actually change sensibilities? He said, well, you can't change.
I'm getting chat messages
sensibilities
here from
just change.
He didn't say that.
Sensitivities.
See, sensitivities.
Ultimately,
Ultimately, she said no, it's not.
I disagree with you. I think that ultimately they're all part of a package of a sort of a deeply embedded common sense, which you could make the argument that what artists and revolutionaries have in common is that they actually are people who do that. A revolution is marked. A revolution really happened when there was a transformation of common sense in the most deeply embodied ways. What I have been thinking about is how do we turn this moment into such a transformation? I mean, there will be a transformation of common sense. So how do we insert ourselves as revolutionaries in a process where transformation of sensibility, sensitivities, common sense are all changing immediately in dramatic ways? And the best we can do is perhaps to intervene in the ways that we can talk and think about it. I've been really thinking very hard about everything from how we measure economic indicators, to the very notion of disciplines like economics and their body of assumptions about human nature that are kind of packaged into them, which have become so much part of common sense. How can they directly be challenged? So my one tentative answer to productivism that I've been trying to develop is the notion of production and consumption are, as we've been pointing out, essentially theological notions. And it's not just monotheism. I mean, there's a lot of traditions of monotheism in the world. Monotheism isn't that big a deal. I think that, people who identify themselves with the Western tradition are a little bit self-important about this. The idea that there is one single supernatural force is not like some incredible breakthrough. It would never have occurred to anybody else, for good or for ill. What seems to be unique about the particular tradition we have we're talking about is precisely the idea of a deity that created the universe out of nothing. So that idea of creation and production seems to, most gods work with existing materials. Their creation is actually a reprocessing and a moment of coalescence and transformation rather than poof, something comes out of nowhere. And that notion, the word production means to push out. You have this idea of this black box of factory, and it's always analogous to a womb. God punishes us by imitating creation. Eve will suffer in labor. Sort of producing babies, men will produce stuff. So that theological notion of productivism, production, that economy is production and consumption. If we were to get rid of that, what would we substitute? How would we rethink it? And so I thought maybe everybody's been talking about care a lot recently, and feminist economists constantly point out that all labor could be conceived as caring labor. Because you make even cars because you care people can get around. So if we start with the value of labor as being in economy is how we take care of each other. Care is the basis of the value of all labor, but we can immediately run into the problem of care as a form of oppression, which is something that we're all grappling with. To what degree is a prison giving care? It feeds and clothes you. Is care all that great? Is it actually a value in itself? So I actually thought maybe the best way out of that is precisely by saying, well, care is action which maintains and enhances another person's freedom, or another entity's freedom, including environments, animals, plants, so all of them have autonomy and freedom to some degree. Because you think of the paradigm of care as a mother and a child, right? A mother takes care of a child so they can grow and thrive, but also so they can play, which is the ultimate expression of freedom in itself, for its own sake. Okay, so in that idea of reformulating essential structures of value, how do we imagine what art does? And this is something Nika and I have been like sort of tossing around. What has happened in a million different ways, because in looking at alternate traditions of how you could reimagine the value of art in any, take it from a Marxist perspective, and I'll end with this. There's the idea that the production of value and the realization of value take place in different spheres. And exploitation is possible because of that rupture. So you produce value in the workplace and it's realized in the market. But even if they're producing value in a home with bringing up children, it gets realized in the public sphere in a way that allows the primary producers to get ripped off. So that's what productivist view of this. But that sphere of realization requires social relations and an audience. In fact, for any given actor, society are those people who you want, in whose eyes you realize value. For everybody has people who they care, whether they know they've achieved something, whether they got something, whether they have something, whether they did something, and other people that it never occurs to them to even wonder what those people think about them. So that is society for them, the audience for the realization of forms of value. So perhaps the work of revolutionary, the revolutionary working phase of art is to think of art not as a production of an object which is realized in a field of value, but to unify the creation of that field and the creation of whatever it is you're thinking of as the art itself. And that would, maybe I should turn it over to Nika. Nika's been thinking very hard about how these issues were dealt with in the very early years of the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, and also to be more practical now and to think what could happen after the lockdown will end. And especially we can take art as an example, because artist is this fictional character that represents this kind of creative work. So I was looking at, now it's a lot of conversation, how to help artists, like Germany gave money to the artists. Gans Fabrice discussing that like the government, the state should introduce the same New Deal. And in this case, it's a lot of, I read some text about American New Deals in 1935, when they employed a lot of people and tens of thousands of artists started to produce public artworks throughout the US. And in the same time, in Soviet Union, it was a lot of public art going on as well in 30s under Stalin regime with like being a propaganda art. But just before that, it was this movement called Proletkult that some of my Russian friends, who is also here, knows about. I don't know how many people knows about that else. So it was one of the founders was Alexander Bogdanov. And the interesting things about that movement is he created basically an infrastructure in which people were able to produce art by themselves. In 1920s, the amount of art that was produced by this new Soviet citizens was amazing, a huge amount.
Hundreds of thousands of
Yeah,
pieces.
it was much more members of the Proletkult than were the Communist Party at that time. And it's very much looked the same as what we see now in lockdown, when the people organize themselves in this huge communities on Facebook and sharing art, and everybody's like singing collectively on the balconies on Zoom conference. So it was really like they created, Proletkult created this infrastructure for play and freedom. And so I grew up in Soviet Union, and I may say that this infrastructure was so strong that even after like Stalin regime and then Yeltsin regime and now Putin regime, it's still there. So everywhere in Soviet Union you have this palaces of pioneers where you can study chess for no money or play music or things like that. So the whole societal tissue was transformed by this. I think 10 years Proletkult exists, not so long time. And then there are the other things that Mazan was talking about, collective immunity. So Alexander Bogdanov he created the Blood Institute for the blood transfusion, because he believed that the same way as art supposed to be this infrastructure for collective creativity, the same things we can maybe live forever, or at least go under the process of constant rejuvenation. Rejuvenation by transporting blood from giving a transfusion of blood from the younger people to the older people. And he was doing that practically. He actually died because he went through this blood transfusion from the person who had malaria, like younger person, and who survived because Bogdanov engaged with him in this process. So and that's it's actually like almost as he was imagining, created a physical infrastructure in which people will be connected to each other, and member of society will kind of maintain this collective life and health and youthfulness, and so on. So yeah, I think that's a very kind of cool point to consider.
Yeah, no, I don't really have anything to add to that. But I mean, I thought one of the things I found so fascinating when I was learning about all this stuff is that we always see Soviet culture as kind of a failure, and in a way it was. They lost, as Nika points out, culturally, because everybody wanted rock and roll and jeans. But the infrastructure they did manage to create in those few years, where they actually Proletkult was like the artistic version of the Soviets. It was, a democratized, bottom-up, collective creation, and really an attempt to really realize the idea of what would it mean for everybody to be an artist. And some of the institutions they created were so dogged that they're still there, despite the government having no support for this. And it's one of the things that managed to sustain people through the collapse of society. Through the collapse of the system of economic disaster, was there were these infrastructures which were created around play and creative expression, but were there and were reliable and still are there, despite the government's attempt to essentially root it out.
Yeah, and so if we talk now, everybody talking about the Green New Deal, but it's really important to get into details and to figure out what kind of Green New Deal we will advocate, because the Green New Deal in the US in 30s was a state-run New Deal that wasn't creating an infrastructure for the artists, for example. It was just the government helped artists during this transition when they were supposed to become a successful entrepreneurs. And in Soviet Union, what they did, they created an infrastructure in which everybody could become an artist. That's how the communism was understood.
That's what communism would mean. Yeah. Once it was finally realized. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course, needless to say, Lenin didn't like this very much and had it suppressed, just like the Soviets. But it's a fascinating counterexample of what could have been.
Yeah. Bogdanov was the second popular person after Lenin in Bolshevik parties, and he was a party, and he was kicked out of the party and of the Proletkult quite recently.
Quite quickly, yeah.
So
There it is.